I know when I suggested to Crystal that I could give a talk here, given a long link with the SSA, I gave two themes. One was the biography I've just co-written on Alan Bennett, or Bhikkhu, who became Bhikkhu Ananda Metteyya in 1901 and 1902 in Myanmar, and the monograph that you've spoken about that was published in 2018. This, of course, is hot off the press, and I've got a few flyers here, but Crystal said no, choose the 2018 monograph because the issues concerned are still very relevant. And so here I am. I haven't even got a copy of the book with me, but I'm drawing on my memory of the book and on two articles I published since the book came out. One is a case study of Cantarode in Jaffna, Contested Histories, Multi-Religious Space and Conflict, a case study of Cantarode in northern Sri Lanka, and the other article, I can get it here, utilising the theology of religions and human geography to understand the spatial dimension of religion and conflict. So I'm drawing on those two. Now, the trigger, I think, as Crystal has suggested, for this 2018 monograph was the ending of the war in 2009 and the triumphalism which followed that ending after mass killings, a triumphalism that created a lineage between the Rajapaksas and the ancient kings of Sri Lanka as protectors of the country and so on. And also news that came to me of the Buddhicization of the North and East. Of course, Buddhist sites in the North had been discovered and developed long before the ending of the war. Dambakolapatuna, the place that was discovered, in inverted commas, as the place where Sanghamitta arrived when she brought the Bodhi to Sri Lanka, that had been, yes, discovered before 2009, and Cantarode also had been reconstructed a little bit before the ending of the war. Now, I suppose I could have predicted that this kind of Buddhicization was going to happen at the ending of the war, but I wanted to go much deeper into the dynamics of it, with questions such as these. Was there anything in the British colonial period that conditioned these developments? Or were pre-colonial patterns being re-envisaged? And why was it that there wasn't a realization in the South that the Buddhicization of the North and East would not lead to reconciliation? It was diametrically opposed to kind of any principles of reconciliation internationally. My research, as Crystal has identified, was concentrated in previous decades on the colonial period, particularly the encounter between Buddhists in Sri Lanka and the evangelical Christian missionaries who started to come to Sri Lanka from 1807 and brought with them a very conservative theology that was exclusivist. And I'll return to exclusivism in a minute. The influence of these evangelical Christian missionaries helped to puncture and challenge the porous boundaries that existed between religions in Sri Lanka. Many studies have been done on this. I mean, I believe there was a hierarchy within different practitioners, but about who was placed at the top of the religious pinnacle. For Buddhists, of course, it was the Buddha, but multiplicity of gods and deities and beings could be ranged below the Buddha. And there was a kind of porous boundary between different centers of religion. Now, the Christian missionaries came in and attacked that and created exclusionary boundaries. And so any kind of multiple religious belonging was frowned upon, particularly in converts to Christianity. Now, I wondered, did anything flow onward from this? There's been another book launch. There's been a book launch a few days ago of a collection of my articles that Robbie Cruz encouraged me to put together, and he was fantastic in actually bringing it all to fruition. But part one concentrates on articles in which I examine this colonial period. But in this talk today, and not an ice cream cone, I want to divide what I'm going to say into three sections. First of all, the academic disciplines that I drew on in the 2018 monograph, Religion, Space and Conflict. Secondly, illustrative examples from the colonial period, focusing on the spatial paradigms that emerged in the 19th century in Sri Lanka as a result of colonialism. And thirdly, I would like to look at the post-independence period, particularly the post-war period. And then, of course, reflect on the question, is all of this still relevant? Crystal's already answered it. I'm speaking to people in Sri Lanka since I arrived at the beginning of January. I think the answer will be yes. And I hope to go up to Jaffna next week and do some more research. But let's see, I want your ideas. I want it to be truly an interactive kind of event. So what academic disciplines did I draw on? My primary discipline, of course, is religious studies, studying religion from a non-confessional perspective. As many of you will know, the bursts of enthusiasm with which religious studies were greeted in England kind of stressed that it might be possible to bracket one's own religious perspective from the study of the data, so that an objective, neutral account would result. But of course, it was then discovered with post-colonial studies, postmodernism, and so on, that of course any researcher cannot bracket who they are, what they are from their research. So my situatedness, I'm a mature, older than that picture there, that was taken about 10 years ago. A mature, white, Western woman with feminist leanings and interest in justice and also in mysticism. That's my situatedness. So religious studies, the principles connected with religious studies was the first discipline that underlay the work. Then human geography, the spatial, particularly the spatial dimension of individual and communal identity. Almost all religious identities have a spatial dimension, and I'm now going to read from my 2022 article on this. Human geographers, however, go further than this. Kong, and some of you will know these names, it's Lily Kong and Orlando Woods, argued in 2016 that the study of space as, and I quote, a main conceptual framework for understanding religious competition, conflict, and violence is not only desirable, but also essential. They built on the work of philosophers such as Lefebvre, who convincingly argued that space was socially produced and intimately connected with power relationships. And postmodern geographers such as Doreen Massey, who stressed in 2005 that space is not a neutral sidekick of time, but a dynamic, political, and constructed category that is predicated on the existence of plurality. If Kong, Woods, Lefebvre, and Massey are taken seriously, therefore, spatial expressions of religious identity not only concern access to the sacred and the transcendent, but also condition power relationships, inclusion and exclusion of religious or ethnic others, and the negotiation of intercommunal and inter-religious relations. I argued in 2018, the book I'm talking about, that one reason for space being key to the negotiation of intercommunal and interreligious relations was that it bore the weight and complexities of the human imaginary. So that's and how I described it in one of the articles I've written on this. And And my 2018 book therefore paid a lot of attention to the imaginaries, the constructed worldviews of different groups of people in Sri Lanka. Christian missionaries, Sinhala Buddhists, Tamils at the sharp end of discrimination. I wanted to look at how they saw the world. And of course, all our worldviews are constructed. Now, my third disciplinary conversation was with the theology of religions. And I think some people who have read the book have kind of raised an eyebrow at this. She's a religious studies person. Why is she engaging with the theology of religions? But it's because the theology of religions has come up with a typology that leaps out of that discipline. It was first the typology of exclusivity, inclusivity, and pluralism. It was first put together systematically by an Anglican clergyman called Alan Race, who used it to describe the different attitudes he saw among Christians towards religious others. And the first emphasis was, are other religions salvific? Do they lead people to liberation or salvation? But actually, those three categories can as potently be applied to how any religious community perceives the other. And of course, exclusivity is drawing non-negotiable distinctions between self and other. Self is superior in every way because self contains truth, purity, and so on. The other, impure or inadequate, even demonic in some cases. Inclusivism, well, I would see it as drawing the other into your own framework of reference, accepting the other because the other is similar to the self. So looking at Christianity through those eyes, a Christian might say, oh, Buddhism has got the fruits of the spirit, patience and love and all that kind of things, therefore it can be accepted. But usually inclusivity doesn't give true parity to the other. It only interprets the other through the self and does not deal with difference, does not actually grapple with what the other could give the self through difference. And then pluralism is, a respecting of difference, can lead to a reciprocal partnership, a willingness to learn, seeing the other as in possession of truth, and so on. And it's the inclusivist category which I've found most helpful in examining Sri Lanka, because a subordination of the other is present, a subordination of the other to one's own framework. And I've used in several things I've written the phrase inclusivist subordination to describe that. You subordinate the other, while at the same time you say you are accepting the other. And I suppose the fourth discipline at the back of my mind when I was writing the 2018 book, of course, was peace studies. I've never done any qualifications or any courses in peace studies, but I've read quite a lot in that area. And I was particularly influenced by a book entitled Moral Imagination, and It's not in my notes. The name of the person who wrote it has just gone completely from my mind. Somebody here who knows? Lederach, John Paul Lederach, of course, John Paul Lederach, Mennonite peace activist. But these, the questions he raises in that book about what moral imagination means and how it is needed in conflict situations in the world. Imaginations that leap out of the box, leap out of one's own kind of identity, leap out of exclusivism, and so forth. So let's go to the second part of my talk, illustrative examples from the colonial period. In the colonial period, especially the 19th century, I've done some work on the Dutch period and the Portuguese period, but that's not my specialist area. The archival work I've done has mainly been in connection with the 19th century. What happened between the Christians, particularly the evangelical Christian missionaries and Buddhists, was due to a clash of cosmologies, which eventually, I believe, led to an appropriation by Buddhists of an exclusivist mindset, particularly in places such as Anuradhapura. During the Kandyan kingdom period of Sri Lanka's history, scholars such as S.J. Tambaya and Geoffrey Duncan have argued that other religions were tolerated and welcomed, but only if they accepted the prior claims and superiority of Buddhism. Geoffrey Duncan makes a very insightful spatial analysis of Kandy before 1815, when the British took over, and showed how the whole town was landscaped to reinforce the superiority of Buddhism. The gods were present, but in a subordinate position to the Buddha, and people of other religions were tolerated, but only if they kind of acceded to this kind of overall framework which had the Buddha at the top and the gods as guardians of Buddhism. It was a classic kind of inclusivist subordination model, really. And a system of patronage and homage existed. Again, I think Duncan points out that the Dutch recognised this, so that when they, from their maritime areas, wrote to the kings in the Kandyan kingdom, they took a posture of homage to kind of, I suppose, butter up the kings of the Kandyan kingdom. They recognised that some kind of patterns of homage and patronage were present. And of course, that mindset was underpinned by an imaginary that saw the whole island as holy to the Buddha, the whole island as the body of the Buddha. And I'm sure many of you have worked with this kind of imaginary and have been aware of it. The island of Sri Lanka is surrounded by narrative connected with Buddhism. From that in Nagadeepa to the east of Sri Lanka, where the tooth relic comes in, hidden in the hair of a royal princess, and so on. The whole island is surrounded by Buddhist narrative, and therefore, in this imaginary, is holy to the Buddha. So the Buddha must take priority. Now, how does that kind of impact on the encounter that took place? Well, in the south at the beginning of the 19th century, when the missionaries arrived, I think there was enough archival evidence to suggest that the monastic sangha would have preferred a respectful, tolerant coexistence rather than confrontation with this new religion or these new missionaries that were coming in. One missionary, Robert Spence Hardy, writes of one conversation with the Buddhist monk. Yes, the Buddhist monk suggested to me that, if only Buddha could be seen as at the highest point then we could all live happily together. Of course, you could worship your Christian God, but, just see the Buddha as at the top. And of course, that was the imaginary that was present. But to Spence Hardy, it was complete anathema. It was horror. No, we are here to make converts. It's God that's at the top, and Jesus as the Son of God, and all that. The paradigm and the theology. So the Buddhist monks eventually turned to absolute confrontation because they realized that the hospitality they'd offered to the Christian missionaries was simply being thrown back into their face. The manuscripts they'd given to missionaries in good faith were used to write articles that undermine Buddhism. Where does space come in here? Well, the missionaries certainly, and in the book there is a chapter on the effect of missionary schools and the building of churches, and the way in which the missionaries drove a dividing line between Christianized space and Buddhicized space, or Buddhist space. Christianized space held all that was good and wholesome, Buddhist space all that needed to be opposed. And so schools and churches tended to be built, if the land could be bought, away from viharas. So school children couldn't be polluted by the viharas, could just go to the school, the Christian school. Now, St. Paul's Church in Kandy is an exception to that, and I make that one of my little case studies in the 2018 book, and I won't go into it now, but I don't think that church was set up as being in direct competition with the Dalai Maligawa. It was far more complicated than that, about what land was available and so on. But anyway, the missionaries tried to create Christianized space that was away from Buddhicized space. And converts could not cross between the two. And those who did and were known to go to the Buddhist ceremonies or to go to the temple, having already been to church, could be struck off the church register. So spatially, you've got this exclusivist paradigm. And I go into great detail into this in the book. In the end, Buddhists took on that same paradigm. And there's a chapter in the 2018 book on Anuradhapura. And I go into the controversies that grew up over the Archaeological Commissioner, H.C.P. Bell. I also look at Haris Chandra, a colleague of Anagarika Dharmapala, and Anagarika Dharmapala himself, because both of them at one point took it on themselves to get a commission of inquiry into the pollution of Anuradhapura. And Anuradhapura at that time, had administrative buildings in it. It had Roman Catholic churches, it had Christian churches, it had. It was plural. It was a multi-religious space, although you had the ruins as well there, and you had administrative offices alongside one of the ruins of Anuradhapura. And Anagarika Dharmapala and his colleague Haris Chandra wrote to the king, the queen, it would have been the queen at that point in England, saying that literally Anuradha had to be purified, that the holy space of Anuradhapura couldn't have Roman Catholic churches, it couldn't have Jesuitical structures. And I wish I had the full quote here, but as you know, I didn't bring the book. Yes, there is this very forceful letter speaking for spatial purity for the sacred city of Anuradhapura. It couldn't have any other religious buildings in it other than Buddhist ones. And so I see almost transferred into Buddhism the missionary exclusivist paradigm in Anagarika Dharmapala. It's quite clear to me. So no doubt at the same time, the porous boundaries existed at many levels in Sri Lanka, porous boundaries between Hindu worship and Buddhist worship and so on. But there was an exclusivity coming in directly learnt from the evangelical Christian missionaries. So to go to the post-independence period and the post-war period. Well, one of my arguments is that after the ending of the war, the Buddhists sought to recreate the inclusivist subordination of the Kandyan kingdom in various ways. And I look at their different aspects of this. In other words, they sought to create a Sri Lanka that throughout the country recognized Buddhism as having the prior claim to the whole country, but with the minorities just beneath this. This was the ideal, and it was a pre-colonial paradigm, according to the work of people like Tambaya and Duncan, as I said, and so it was kind of resurrected. But behind it all was an exclusivity that was also learned during the colonial period, and so the island of Sri Lanka, and you may disagree, this had to become the body of the Buddha again. Now my case study of Kanturode, in Tamil, Kadurugoda, Kadurugam, I'm probably not saying this correctly in Sinhala, Kadurugoda. It was present in the book, but it's amplified in this article that I wrote. Now, I visited Kanturode twice, in 2011 and 2015. In 2011, the army was in control and there was hardly any other visitors there at all. When I first arrived, I was told immediately to take off my shoes and to pay homage to the Buddha at the shrine that was there. And then I was shown the remains. So although the site was really part of the archaeological department, I, as a foreign visitor, was expected to treat it as a religious site. In 2015, when I went, there were far more Sinhala pilgrims there, and I had a Tamil friend with me who also knows Sinhala, so was able to overhear much better than I could what was being told to the Sinhala pilgrims. And again, I'm sure you will know what was being told to those pilgrims. And it was the argument of the monk Meghananda, self-styled archaeologist, namely that Kanturode was once a completely Sinhala Buddhist site, that it had been destroyed by Tamils, desecrated, defiled by the Tamil community, and so on, with a great deal of emotion attached to that narrative. We're talking, I said at the beginning, and stress the emotive, affective kind of elements of space. The imaginaries, emotions are projected onto space, and were being done so by the tour guide. But, of course, there is another narrative about Kanturode. And in my field visits to Jaffna, I spoke to several Tamil archaeologists who gave me other perspectives, and also engaged with a whole book written by Siva Tyagaraja, who's a Western-based Tamil doctor or medical professional, who also is interested in archaeology. Now, the planks of his argument in the book, drawing on archaeologists such as Krishnaraja and Sichampalam. Kanturode was initially a megalithic city in continuity with the megalithic culture of India, long before the emergence of the Sinhala language and the Sinhalas as an ethnic group. Kanturode was the capital of an ancient Naganadu, which embraced a third of the island's space, including contemporary Trincomalee, the islands off the Jaffna Peninsula and what is called the Valley today. Canterbury was a trading hub for South Asia, a centre for Hindu-Buddhist commercial activity. Buddhist remains at Canterbury point to Tamil Mahayana Buddhism, which overlapped with megalithic culture and was similar to the Amaravati Buddhist tradition in India. The Tamil Buddhism was prevalent in Jaffna until the end of the 7th century CE. Tamil Buddhism was ignored by the Theravada Buddhists of Anuradhapura, as demonstrated by the fact that the Mahavamsa fails to mention the association of Tamils with Buddhism. Evidence pointing to an early Dravidian or Tamil culture at Canterbury and other Buddhist sites in the north, for instance, the presence of Dravidian red and black pottery ware and a Tamil Brahmi script, is ignored by Sinhala historians and politicians in the present. So that was Siva Tyagaraja. I know my interviews with Professor Krishnaraja, and the artifacts he showed me in the University of Jaffna pointed to what I think is fact, that at the lowest level of archaeological evidence in Sri Lanka, there are South Indian artifacts. Now, this completely, of course, contests the Sinhala nationalist narrative about Kadarugona, as proof that once the island was completely peopled by Sinhala Buddhists and was then, destroyed from the north downwards for a little way by the Tamil invaders. And so Tyagaraja goes on to say that the stupas at Canterbury should not have been restored according to a southern Buddhist template. I don't know how many of you have been there. You've been to Canterbury and have seen, how you've got the foundations of structures there, which have been assumed by Sinhala Buddhists to be in a lineage with Anuradhapura. And so some of them have been slightly restored, and you can see if they've been completely restored, they would have been kind of Buddhist stupas. But Tamil archaeologists would say differently. They say that the same basic structure could have supported structures that were similar to those in India. So I wrote in 2022, it is far more likely, Tyagaraja argues, that they were a burial complex, tombs rather than stupas, a Buddhicized version of megalithic monuments. He pointed to similar Buddhist sites in Andhra Pradesh at Amaravati and Nagarjunakonda, where clusters of small stupas were built over megalithic burial sites, and claimed that the site at Canterbury was unique for having the same pattern. So his argument is that the Department of Archaeology itself willfully kind of ignored some of the evidence that was there to create a Buddhist national kind of narrative completely. Now, so Canterbury, in my imagination in the past, would have been, a multi-religious site. Certainly there would have been Sinhala Buddhist in the north who would have gone there. There would have been Tamil Buddhist in the north who would have gone there. It would have been a multi-ethnic site. And yet it's been reduced in the modern period, and particularly the post-war period, so that it is simply represented to, at least to Sinhala Buddhists, as a Sinhala Buddhist site, reducing the history of the island and so forth. So that was my one kind of the case study I was going to concentrate on, but it's not my showing. But also going to the hot springs, again, a similar pattern can be seen. The hot springs at Trincomalee, a site, a multi-religious site, with, and someone I interviewed in the East there spoke, an elderly man said, well, when I was young, we went to the hot springs and it was linked with Rama and Hindu narrative and this kind of thing, and everybody from every religious community was there. Now if you go, the history has been distorted, and it's completely presented as being a site that has a lineage with the period of singular Buddhism in the country. And so the rich multi-religious import of that site is being destroyed, although I think still Buddhists and Hindus and others still continue to patronize it. So, okay, let me tie up, finish. So, is this all relevant today? I suppose I'm going back to that question. Well, since I came here, of course, I've heard of the controversy over the building in Jaffna of very large vihara on land that is legally owned by Tamil families, and the court cases that are going through there. I don't have all the details about that, but it does seem to me to be in the same lineage, in the same landscape as all the things I've just been talking about, that land is still being taken to subordinate minorities in Sri Lanka. Oh yes, you can build. Tamils, of course, they can build and restore their kovils. They can build statues of Ganesh and all this, but there must be the Buddha there as well. It's the same kind of imaginary. So I would say it's still relevant, but I think I'm just going to pass over to you and say, what do you think?